So today it's dedicated to the book of Catherine and Anne Bazin, and to the issue of loss, to the way it is dealt with by individuals who have lost, by public discourses and historiographies in particular.
I would like to start with a few words about the genesis of the book before explaining our approach to the topic and our methodology. So I would like to go back to the questions actually we raised and the way we tried to provide some elements of answer. So because you're not interested in, I mean, seeing us all the time, we prepared a short PowerPoint so that you have a few images. Oh, but you have to give me the access to the, because I cannot so far actually share my screen. Michèle, could you do something, or?
I think, Jérôme, you have to share the...
Or Florence, maybe, I don't know.
Well,
if it's not possible, that's not a big deal, but if you maybe name me as a co-animator or something like that, it should work.
I'm sorry, I don't have the ownership of the...
Okay.
So well, I can't do anything, but...
Okay, I can start anyway. It's not that interesting, but it, you know, it was just an eye.
I think we are going to fix it.
Okay. Yes, great. Thank you. Not that it is that interesting though, but it's just I think it makes it a little nicer. The starting point actually of this collective research is a kind of a statement or an observation. Catherine and I have been researching for years on memory issues and politics of history, especially about the expulsion of the Germans from Central Europe after World War II. While working on this topic, we have noticed that the debates about the expulsion of the Germans often refer to other population exchanges, especially the one between Greeks and Turks in the 1920s, but also other populations displacements during or after World War II in Italy, in Finland, Poland, as well as, of course, as in the USSR. We also noticed that comparisons were introduced by the actors themselves, sometimes for political reasons, and the comparisons between apparently quite different cases, German expulsion, the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the French decolonization, French loss of Alsace and Lorraine in 1870, the Palestinian Nakba, and so on and so forth. But the truth is that these comparisons were barely analyzed in the literature and never as such. I mean, for the comparison itself. At best, they are mentioned within a national analysis. And this is really the starting point of our questioning. That is the gap between the, let's say, empirical findings and scientific analysis. Then that raised actually new questions. First one being, why is this issue not addressed actually in a comparative approach in the academic literature, since the actors themselves use that comparison? Secondly, what are the difficulties and also perhaps the resistances that make the issue of forced displacement so rarely addressed in a comparative way? And of course, what could the comparison bring to the understanding of the phenomenon? So to what extent does a comparative approach bring a new perspective and therefore help maybe to refine the analysis? So in an attempt to answer these questions, we have identified cases in Europe and at its margins with the idea to confront them in order to contribute to a comparative research on the policies of the past and policies of history relating to forced migrations associated with the loss. So it's a little long, but that's important. So the loss of territory, homeland, culture, language. Catherine will get back on that later because it's obviously quite important. And if possible, we wanted to analyze their emergence of a new approach to collective memory and a culture of remembrance, which would include all forms of official representations of the past. At the same time, the issue of territorial loss due to movements of population has been largely addressed by academia. But usually not through the lens of how does the issue interfere with the present and how it evolves with regard to the political constraints, for instance, of good neighborhood and European or international standards that have especially emerged since the end of the Cold War. And actually our ultimate objective being to analyze the emergence of a new approach to collective memory and a culture of remembrance, which includes all forms of, well, let's say, just say political, official representations of the past. So in the cases discussed in this book, forced migrations have been accompanied by territorial transformations. Entire populations have been expelled or have had to leave territories in which they had lived, sometimes for centuries, and they have had to integrate into a state considered, sometimes actually is in a very exogenous way, as their homeland. And indeed, as we know, it was not necessarily obvious. For example, just to stick to the Czech and German case, for instance, were the Sudeten Germans more German than Austrian. So we refer to the broad definition of forced migrations by Krzysztof Hruśniewicz, sorry. That is, I quote, so mass movements of people which are carried out by direct or situational coercion exercised by state power organs or local actors. He mentioned also, so there are victims. The victims are mostly ethnic, social, or religiously defined groups, which are to be separated from the rest of the population of the given territories. These are often minorities or other groups which have been given the special status, often as a result of changes in national boundaries. They may be citizens of the former or of a state regarded as hostile, or also as a result of the disintegration of a multinational state that bears the necessity of the reconstruction of states and therefore be stateless. I'll continue with the quotation of Krzysztof Hruśniewicz. Forced migrations usually take place in the context of a war with an external aggressor, a civil war, or of the implementation of an ideologically motivated socio-political project, such as the creation of a nationally united state, for instance, or the totalitarian reconstruction of a society. Forced migrations are also characterized by the fact that the affected persons have no influence on the happening and usually cannot change the top-down assignment or categorization, national identity, race, class, and so on and so on. And actually, that was not the purpose of the book, but the question of vocabulary that we are going to maybe discuss later, whether it's expulsion, exchange of population, exodus, and so on and so forth, is very interesting and could be obviously studied for its own. So the different chapters of the book cover cases from north to south and from east to west of Europe and a little bit beyond. And they show something interesting to underline, that actually forced migration is not just an Eastern European experience, as actually still many people think today. So the book opens with the case of the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe and the loss of what the Germans call the Heimat, the homeland. This case is a central case for our comparative study for at least two reasons. First of all, because of the intensity of the debates on memory in Germany, and also because of the role played by the politics of history in that country or among the expelled Germans since the end of the war. And then the following chapters deal with the issue of the repatriation of Poles from the Eastern territories, the Kresy, which were lost at the end of the war after the relocation of the eastern borders of Poland in 1945. The loss of Karelia, a region ceded by Finland to the USSR after the Second World War. Thirdly, the so-called exodus of the Italians of Istria and Dalmatia is another example that also fits actually into the context of World War II and at least the immediate post-war period. Beyond the borders of the European Union, the links of Greek and Turkish exchanges with their lost homelands has been analyzed actually in two chapters, so from both sides in a way, and we thought that would be interesting to have the two entry. And finally, the expulsions of Jewish communities from Muslim countries after the creation of the State of Israel is the last case study that we have had that we included in the book. The book actually is the result of a conference that we organized a little before, so already 5 years ago, at the CERI in Paris, with there were also other participants, and there could have been obviously much more case studies, as we may discuss actually later on. And actually, at the conference in Paris, we also discussed papers on Serbia, for instance, about Bulgaria and Macedonia, as well as about Russia after the USSR. We could get back on that. So anyway, these examples come from clearly very different political, geopolitical, and historical contexts. And they cover actually almost the whole 20th century. And what's interesting, we think, is that actually these apparently very different cases actually happen to raise questions that are ultimately quite close. So this is what we'll try to show. So one last thing I would like to say is a few words about the comparison and what we hope is the added value of the comparison. So I just said that the first question we asked ourselves was the weakness of comparative approaches, and to try to understand why, we started with a statement that there is very little debate at the European level on the issue of forced migration, which seems a priori surprising, since the memory of this trauma is shared by many groups in Europe and by millions of people in the continent. Of course, it would be false and inaccurate to say that the subject has been ignored or silenced. There is no explicit will either at the European level or even at national level to prevent a debate on the question of the expulsions and population transfers that took place in Europe and its periphery during the whole 20th century, nor even to silence this past. We are here referring to debates that take different forms and pursue different objectives, from the claim of a status, for instance, of victim, to demands, symbolic, like the erection of monuments or other, of course. But what is surprising, well, to us, however, is the fact that this clearly painful, I'd say, memory, deeply rooted in the memories of European nations, is not actually perceived as a shared memory, even though forced migrations are by nature very often transnational events. But the memory of those migrations is still today mainly cultivated within national frameworks. So at the European level, this would say inability or lack of willingness, this is something that we could probably discuss actually later, to address the issue in public debates is partly due to the fact that the issue is perceived as likely to create tensions between neighboring states, which is reinforced by the fact that almost no work of memory has yet been conducted on this past, neither within national frameworks, or actually very few, nor a fortiori at a transnational or binational level. And the European Union does not seem yet, at least, to be able to offer, I'd say, consolidated space in which to discuss those issues. This difficulty in addressing the memory of forced migration at the European level may also be due to the fact that member states themselves are uncomfortable with this part of their national past. Population transfer is a complex phenomenon, and many states that had actually to welcome or to integrate expellees or returnees have often been also the cause of forced displacement or eviction. Just to look at Poland, Greece, Turkey, Germany. So as a matter of fact, the question of forced migration almost always introduces a dissonance into national narratives, which most often are seen from the point of view of the winner, in the sense that it forces to unveil other parts of national history, some dark or not very glorious, let's say, episodes, producing therefore counter narratives that often call for critical revisiting of national myth. And we know how difficult such a new reading is, which actually often requires or an external impulse, or at least a very favorable context. So from this point of view, forced migration is also a challenge for history writing, both at European and at national level. And taking into account these migrations requires questioning also the temporal and geographical frameworks of the writing of Western history, even if it's not our topic here, but this is clearly something that appears in our research. For instance, is the expulsion of the German the first act of the post-war period or the conclusion of the war? Obviously, the two approaches have quite different political implications. And one last comment before I leave the floor to Catherine. Today's Europe has been built to a large extent on the trauma of a recent past, World War II and the Holocaust. So the question we would like to raise here is why the memory of forced migration has not been integrated into the founding memory of the Union. As I just mentioned, part of the answer is probably to be found in the fact that these are complex and interlaced memories that do not fit into common categories: winner, defeated, perpetrator, victims, and so on and so forth. This could also be explained by the fact that the memory of loss associated with forced migration refers to complex internal debates also that question the core identity of European nations. It appears rather difficult to promote a debate on these issues within the states we are studying in this book, or for CERI today. Maybe not all of them, but most of them. However, such a debate appears to be, maybe a necessity or certainly a necessary first step in order to be able to continue the discussion at the transnational or European level, which could in fact contribute to strengthening a European identity through the recognition of shared experiences on which to build a common future. But this is another thing, and we are not entering into science fiction or what the European Union may do or may be able to do. So I'm going to give the floor to Catherine now, who is going to enter a little more into the discussion and especially explaining what's the loss. Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And I won't repeat all the thanks Anne said, but I'm very happy, as Anne said, to be back to CEFRES in this virtual way to present this book, which is certainly an outcome of our presence in Prague at the beginning or at the middle of the 90s. It has certainly been very much influenced by this experience of being at CEFRES at that time. Well, let me now come to the third point, which is how to define and address the loss, how to address this painful past, this kind of other negative memory, European memory. If we want to understand how hosting states and societies, as well as groups and individuals that were forced to leave, deal with the painful memory of forced migrations, I think it's necessary to examine how they framed or how they defined the different types of losses. This issue of the loss is, I think we can see it, and it is seen also by the actors themselves, to be core to this experience of forced migrations and links it with memory. The populations that were forced to flee or who were displaced collectively. That is to say that the entire group, or almost all of it, left a given territory. These populations generally left with a minimum of goods, and they usually left forever with no hope of return, even if that issue is sometimes part of their claim. I mean, returning back, like for instance, the Heimatrecht, the German expellees are claiming, even though the term Heimatrecht is a very complex term and not so easy to define, at least to say legally what it is. Well, the rupture is very significant. These people had to leave behind in a more or less definitive way their native lands, towns and villages with their monuments, places of worship, places of sociability, cemeteries where their ancestors were buried, archives, and a collection of objects of historical value to them, of artistic or ethnographic or religious value, as well as their cultural and social, or at least a part of their cultural and social practices. Sometimes, like in Germany after World War II, expellees from the same region, for instance, or town, or from same village, were not even allowed to settle together as a group. They were dispersed among the whole territory. So this is why we choose to consider the category of loss as a very relevant account to this experience, or this is why it seems that this category... I continue with the loss, which seems to be a very relevant category to account for this experience. But it's not only that that urges us to take it to analyze it. We find this term also in the popular, in the political discourse, but also in the writing of many historians, where it is very present. The notion of loss is also found in the policies dealing with patrimonialization of the cultural heritage of this past, whether there are monuments, works of arts, liturgical objects, archives located outside the borders of the hosting states or of the new states. So in the cases at hand, the legitimacy of territorial losses has been put into question, as well as the question of ownership of the heritage through claims for restitution and repatriation. But beyond that, in addition to claims for restitution, hosting states and groups of expellees have also worked towards patrimonializing, that is, I don't know the English term for this, making out of something a heritage, what had been lost, trying to confer to that what had been lost and identifying value. And this is where it becomes much more complex. If the rhetoric of loss is intrinsically linked to the experience of forced migration and border movement, it is not without ambiguities. This is what Eva Hahn and Hans-Henning Hahn show in the chapter dealing with the German case, raising some apparently simple, but in reality quite complex questions, which I have written there. Well, what is the loss, they ask? What exactly is this loss, and who lost what? More importantly also, how and when? And by virtue of what can be considered that what has been lost is important for national identity or for the group's identity, as it is often claimed? And who decides about this importance? And to what extent is this identity construction still valid today? Is it the loss? Is the loss still the core of the identity of the group? Well, all these are the questions Eva Hahn and Hans-Henning Hahn asked. And we thought that there were certainly questions that could be posed to all cases that were in the book. Well, it's important to notice that at the collective level, loss is associated with trauma and associated trauma are very complex issues. As you have understood, what has been lost collectively is often politically challenged. What has been lost collectively is also often historically challenged. As all case studies in the book show, the repeated displacement of borders and sovereignty in some territories over the past few decades has made it difficult to answer the question of what belongs to whom and who belongs to what. We see that, for instance, a very good example of this is, of course, the change in borders in the east of Germany. Well, Germany used to be, you see my cursor, from the Memel, as it is said, to the what is the other, well, at least it used to go to the Memel, which is here, to the west. It used to be much bigger, and the eastern parts have been lost in 2 times. So to which border do you refer when you refer to the loss? As the case study presented in the book show, lost territories very often bordering territories, multi-ethnic and disputed territories like precisely these ones, like the Kresy, Karelia, Istria, and Dalmatia, Silesia, and many others, were territories that were historically disputed by nation state in formation before the loss. Those territories already enjoyed a special status in the historical propaganda of the states before the population had to flee or were expelled, exchanged, transferred, or repatriated. And quite often the unity and the identity of the group that has been expelled is a post-expulsion creation and a kind of result of the memorialization process and policies. So I would like to give another example of what I would call the confusion of, or the complexity about what has been lost. And this map is a perfect example of this. It is to take the German case that I know the best. it is quite often the loss of the German East that is deplored. But this German East, Deutscher Osten, whose German-speaking populations were expelled, never existed as such. What is subsumed under this problematic, very problematic expression, commonly used until the years 2000, and which is still used by people not being right-wing, how do you say, extremist, is a mosaic of territories, which you see here, with very variable status, and in which the German presence took very different forms, which you don't see here, where the German-speaking groups developed different identities, which we also don't see on that map, even different idioms, based on different religious affiliations, as well as very different historical experiences. It's very different to be a German or German-speaking Saxon here from Transylvania than being a German from Cheb, or I don't know, a Baltic German here from this region and from the Tsarist Empire. So those are very different historical experience, and there was a very different duration also of the presence on the spot, and quite different relations vis-a-vis other population groups. And what this map also doesn't show is that the presence or the settlements were also very different. Some were very compact and others, and the Germans were a majority, and in others, they were just a small minority. Some of these territories, like the ones you see here, were part of the German Reich, but not all of them. But even if we consider the former territories that belong to the Reich, the question arises as where to place the historical cursor. As I just said, is it this border, this part that should be given back, or do you also include that part? Are we talking about the borders of 1937, as it is often the case? But this is very paradoxical because it is forgetting, as Eva and Hans-Henning Hahn point out, that those borders were very contested at the time by the German government, and that large part, and by large parts of the populations. Just remember Germany in the how to say, between the two world wars, were claiming to get back that part of the Reich. Are we talking about settlement areas, which means all that part of Eastern Europe? So you see, it's a very complex issue. And is German East a generic term for what has been lost? It then becomes difficult to define and locate, okay? So the seniority of the presence, as well as the numerical importance of minorities, vary considerably. But more than that, one has to wonder what justifies calling these multi-ethnic territories, which are shown here, German. Were they more German than Czech, Polish, Hungarian, or Jewish maybe? In the cases at hand, no. Now, coming back to the issue of the loss, how to measure the loss resulting from the destruction also of relationship with the others. The more, since group identity is often constructed in relation to other groups, against it sometimes, like Czech identity in Bohemia, which as František Palacký has written in the middle of the 19th century, was built in interaction and in permanent conflict with the German one. So one of the question is, what then happens to those groups when they are disentangled? Which also leads us to a question that we did not address in our book, but what about the loss seen from the point of view of the expelling states and society? For instance, I know that Johana Wyss is working on that issue, and that is maybe the issue tackled by the Tandem project, which would be the other side of the coin and which needs to be thought together. So to conclude, on the collective level, the repeated displacement of borders over the last century in some territories makes it even more confusing to answer the question of what belongs to whom and who belongs to what and where. Now at the individual level, well, I don't know, I don't have a slide for this. Trauma and loss may seem easier to identify. I was speaking at the collective level before. Now at the individual level, trauma and loss may be seem easier to identify. People have lost family members, material goods, houses and all kinds of other possessions. This is easy to identify. But they also have lost, as I already mentioned, is their social environment, links with their ancestors, sometimes a language or a dialect, part of their traditions and customs, skills, and finally their home, their Heimat, in short, a kind of rootedness. And this is much more difficult to measure and assess. Even though in some aspects, the loss is similar to what ordinary migrants might experience in terms of nostalgia also, it's in some ways very different, since what has been lost has disappeared for good. The Heimat has changed. You cannot go back there due to population exchange. But also, and this is maybe making it even more complicated due to time passing by and to modernization processes, which is sometimes not taken into account by the ex-police. And here I have an example, but maybe we can talk about it later, of the exhibitions Misele Sudeti, which is quite questionable, but I will continue. So in the case discussed in this book, it's not only the legitimacy of the territorial losses, but also the ownership of what was left by the expelled population, which has been put into question. There are requests for restitution and reparations from the ex-police or from the associations that represent them, and sometimes from their new states. But more interesting is the process of patrimonialization by both host states and groups of ex-police. And this is about giving specific value to what has been lost in terms of identity. And these patrimonialization processes were also a response to the efforts made by the expelling states to make this heritage, this past presence, less visible or even disappear, or at least in the first years after expulsion, when it was perceived as necessary to erase the traces of the past presence of the deported groups. So it is quite interesting to analyze how the role of this heritage in the identity was built and for what purpose and by whom and when. See, for instance, and one example is to be questioned is here on this picture is the financing, renovation and expansion of by the Federal Republic of Germany of a regional museum of Eastern Prussia. It's the one you see here in Lüneburg, which is close to Hamburg. What does this mean? How to interpret this? The museum is built on the same model than other regional museums that exist very commonly in the German Länder to display regional history, like the Württembergisches Landesmuseum, for instance. If not, to maintain the fiction of a continuity of the belonging to Germany of this territory, now shared between Poland and the Russian Federation. So these are questions to be posed. Well, now to the last point, which is a few words about the choice to use the term of politics of history. And this has to do about the poids et choix du passé, as Marie-Claire Lavabre say, weight and choice of the past. And this is what politics of history allow us to do best. So before concluding, I would like to say a word to explain why we use this concept of politics of history, Geschichtspolitik in German. designed during the Historikerstreit in the late 80s in Germany, and since taken over by historians such as Edgar Wolfrum, Konrad Jarausch, or Etienne François, and internationally used. The question was how to grasp the divergent interpretations of the past, not only among expelling states and receiving states, but inside receiving states and society, and sometimes among expellees themselves. Various stakeholders have an interest in the memory of the loss and forced migrations. First of all, the groups expelled, but also historians, and as well states and their governments. So these actors interact at different levels. The concept of politics of history helps us to examine how these various stakeholders load history with their interests and try to use it for political ends. The concept thus helps to shed light on the way the actors competed to impose their narrative and their interpretations of the past. Studying the politics of history or a politics of the past allows a dynamic vision of memory, and it permits to capture memory as an intrinsically linked to present issues. It also permits to study the institutional means by which the past is kept alive beyond the writing of history. Celebrations, memorial days, museums, archives, institutions dedicated to making the past present, and also the non-institutionalized memory-related activities coming from civil society, films, novels, artworks, testimonials, etc. Because it includes all forms of representations of the past, this notion allows us to overcome the binary opposition between the institutionalized forms of memory and the way ordinary people react to a vision imposed from above. Therefore, looking at the politics of history is a good way to highlight the conflicts, cooperation, competitions, in a word, the power relations between multi-positioned actors in the field of memory. And as a matter of fact, this is particularly evident in the case of forced migrations, in which historians are also activists. Politicians involved in the memorial debates are often expellees themselves or descendant of expellees, while at the same time, the leaders of these associations may hold a political mandate. So we see that the borders are blurred between all those categories. Maybe this is where I will stop. I'll go back to the slide with the chapters of the book. I thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to give the floor maybe to the discussion and to questions if there are some. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne Bazin. Thank you, Catherine Perron, for this very stimulating presentation. Now I will turn over to Catherine Gousseff and Katja Hrobat if they want to react, comment.
So, hello to everybody. First of all, I wanted to say how impressive is this book from two main points of view. The first one is the introduction by the scientific editors. I found very inspiring and in a way very original, not only because of the topic, but the way you really discuss all the contributions of the main contributions of specialists engaged in this large history of forced migrations. And so given the idea of the internationalization of this field, and it is not so often that you can find in this, as we have in this introduction, so many references not only to the American or Anglo-Saxon field, but also from German, Italian, and so on. And I think this is very, very impressive indeed. And from this point of view, I think this is more than an introduction. This is a kind of essay which can be also very useful for people to be introduced in the topic more in the more broader terms of the word, not only for this topic about loss. The book, the many different case studies also are quite fascinating, and you already mentioned them, so I will not go back to every of them. But for instance, the Karelian case is very rarely asked, and it is quite important. And it was done in a very original way, I think, as well as the Jews from Islamic countries. It's also a case you rarely find contribution to that topic, because we have a lot of collective volumes now, collective volumes about population transfer, forced migrations, but it is mostly about forced migration after the Second World War. And so to have this, this overview in all the 20th century, I think it's a great deal, and it was very well done. So this is for the common remark. Now I wanted to, my first the first point I wanted to discuss on, Catherine, you come back to it just a few minutes ago about your choice to speak about politics of history. And I think you give an answer to the question I had, even if I think that inside the book you have some cases which are not really linked to the politics of history. From my point of view, the case in which politics of history is very well asked is the Karelian case, indeed, because of the main contribution of historians and the way the trajectory of this national historiography, how to finally a very late historian came to the topic of Karelia. This is something very interesting. But if you take the case of Italian from Istria, I think you don't have here politics of history. You have from one part historians who did a very good job in showing the very diversity of this history of expulsion, forced migration, and here I will not talk more about, because I know that Katja Hrobat is a real specialist on this question. So, but just to remain from one part, these works by historians, and from the other part, the political use of the past, who did Berlusconi and people associated with this time of Berlusconi, in order to wake up and to interpret the history of Exodus. And here we have typically the case of politic of memory, in the way we can think about in Central Europe, together with these institutes of national memories, as it is in it exists in Poland or in Ukraine or in many different countries. So from my point of view, the best term to use in order to give the overview of all the book would have been the political use of the past, or the politics of the past, which is, from my point of view, more comprise more all the case studies you can find in the book. I apologize for my English because we were asked to be very spontaneous, but the spontaneity, you know, sometimes is quite a challenge, especially with the language. The other point I wanted to discuss is the question of whether it was never asked, the question of forced migration, the question of laws at the European level. First, I think, of course, and you already said that or suggested that the answer is of course inside the case studies of the book, because you can see in this book and in a very nuanced way how this memory and even the comprehension of loss can be different, not only between different cases, but inside the same one. And I think from that point of view, the way the question of Greek expelled from the former Ottoman Empire is very, very intriguing from this point of view, because you see the many different ways people react and according to the place of their origin, and how it is diverse in itself, this experience. But there is, beyond all this diversity, complexity of history, I think that the reference of the Holocaust as a way to ask the question why this also painful past is not discussed at the European level is, from my point of view, quite clear. Because first of all, we have to consider that the Holocaust is probably the only one historical topic which indeed exists in many different ways at the institutional level. And I think the goal of that is very clear and very simple. It is never this again. And this is today, and in a very evident way, the reason why all the European countries have to integrate this fact as this past in one or other way in their own history. And what can we say for forced migration? I remember that, for instance, Norman Neymark, who wrote a very good book, Fire of Hatred, at the very beginning of the 2000 years. It was one of the first statements in his introduction was that, referring to the Yugoslavian wars, he said, never this again. And indeed, the Yugoslavian wars were part of the dynamic to study forced migration during the 90s, together with the archives, the fall of the communist regime, and so on. But what can we say today? Can we say, when we see, for instance, the question since 2014 with Ukraine, a civil war, a kind of civil war inside Ukraine, the separation between all the separatist region and the other one from the government of Kiev. We are not sure. We don't know about the future, and we can easily imagine that one of the solutions will be a new wave of forced migration. And we already know that more a million of people fled this region, whether to the east or to the west. So I think that if there will be a reason to ask the question, to put the question at the European level, it of course the goal will be as for the Holocaust, never that again. But we can't say that. We don't know, and we realize how fragile is a kind of peaceful way we find now in Europe, and so it is my 2 points for the moment. Maybe I will come back later in the discussion. Thank you.
What I would like to say, it's more my reflections when Catherine first gave me this book when she came to a conference to Slovenia. And for me, I have to say that it was a big inspiration, this collective monograph. And it made me think a lot especially about some topics that I will now mention, but mostly they will not be so wider as of the ones of Catherine Gousseff, as I will derive from my own study case, which is a bit different than all the others, because yes, I studied the Italian Exodus, as we would say, but as Johana, I'm more concentrated on the country, let's say, that made the expulsion. Otherwise, we even can't say expulsion this. So mostly on the people who remained in the, let's say, empty territory. And here I come to one of my first questions. It's about naming, because the author said that it was very difficult to name all these processes, let's say, of population transfer. And it's true, and that's why there's no possibility, I think, to have a shared memory, or maybe we would really have to do, as Aleida Asman said, to be empathic towards the other and listen to the memories of the other, because each state has its own politics of the past, what Catherine would say. Like I see with the Exodus, which is on one way called Exodus as a total emptying of the territory, and by Italians, while on the Slovenian and Croatian side, so on the Yugoslavian side, it strictly use the term of migrations. So if a Slovenian researcher, as me, I'm using the term Exodus, I'm every time attacked by my researchers for using the term which is the Italian vision of the history. And here it's again deriving from the question how the expulsion was made. Was like the Italian was based on the international treaties, so the people had the chance to opt. And this is the statement that the Yugoslavian historians had, so they called migrations. And on the Italian way, in fact, they are refusing this option of the free will, like the indirect circumstances, the change of the states, of the ideology from fascism to communism was the one who made flee these people. So it's true, we don't have a total empty territory here, but we have the 90% of refugees and the 10% of population which remained as Italians, and they were given national rights. So it's really the question of how to name, is there a common name for all this? So another comment, it made me think, is about the political instrumentalization of the past, when both authors said that not a lot of historians linked these population transfers to the present. So it made me think about the political use of the past, as Catherine Gousseff mentioned, the political use of the past in Italy. So we can even widen it to the political use of Europe. So also the authors mention how the some countries which were members of the European state blackmailed the countries that were in a subordinated position to accept their discourse as a condition to enter the European Union. So or let's say maybe to rewrite the history. With this is linked also the question of the compensation for the confiscated or abandoned real estate. And this was also the case when I spoke with both Catherines when they were in Slovenia. This is one case that Slovenia and Italy had, while most of the other states did not. As before it was said, the European states do not dare to speak about this difficult past because it brings tensions. But these tensions can be then used for this to maintain political power. So here also Italy, for the entrance of Slovenia to the European Union, gave the condition to pay for the lost property, as Catherine was saying. So there was made a treatment, and then Italy gave the property of these refugees in exchange for the war damage, for the fascism, while then Yugoslavia agreed to pay an amount, 110 millions of dollars, for the compensation of this property. Slovenia had made all this payment. And why is today the problem? Because Italy never raised this money from bank. So letting a really difficult past not to be closed. So in order to manipulate it more and more again. And we can clearly see these power relations right now. We were discussing in this Tandem project too, when now similarly Bulgaria is conditioning Macedonia to enter to the European state by trying that the Macedonian rewrites the history where the Bulgarians are seen as the fascist occupiers. So here is, with these population transfers, we also have always the power relations between the states and who has the right for the truth, the historical truth. And what made me think from the book of Catherine and Anne was also this saying that the refugees reject the rejection of the oblivion as a means of claiming lost territory or property or the right to return. And here again, we have this case with Italy and Slovenia, when Catherine asked what is heritage, I would say, and she also asked this, whose heritage is it? By us also happened that the heritages of the Venetian art were taken during the World War II to Italy, and today they have a status of the relic for the Italian migrants, for the esuli, we say. And here comes the question, to whose is this heritage? Is that heritage is part, it's something that is part of the people, so of the refugees, or the cultural milieu, or the heritage is part of the place where they were created. And here is again a conflict of national interpretation. Whose heritage is that? So with this politics of the past that has been used a lot in these international conflicts, we have to think also of the brave politicians that are trying to make some reconciliation steps, international steps. We had last year a big reconciliation step when the two presidents of Slovenian and Italian president were visiting the lieu de mémoire of the both states. On one side, showing the empathy toward the memories of the others, so of the migrants, laying the wreath to the lieu de mémoire of the esuli, so the foibe. And on the other side, the Italian president and the Slovenian president made a visit to, it was the 100th anniversary of the burnt of the Slovenian household in Italy. So the beginning of the fascist era and of violent fascism of 20 years long lasting towards Slavs. So in all this conflict memory, politics of memory of the past, let's say, we have some reconciliation steps. We even had the Slovenian-Italian Historical Commission, but it seems that these reconciliation steps are not heard by the ones who would like to make this shared European memory, because it's easier, I think, to maintain power managing with the conflicts. Yeah, these are only some small thoughts I wanted to say, and maybe just ending really with this diversity of these population transfers. If we think of the expulsion of the Germans that were very violent, mostly, then we have the Yugoslavian, where Germans too were expelled, but then also Italian were based on the international treaties, let's say on the free will. But then the question is, what is the free will if the circumstances change? And then we have these population transfers in the 90s from Yugoslavia. This Jasna Chapo studied, where she showed that there was no politics behind. So really people exchanging houses because of the impossibility to live on. And here is the question that Michèle always says with Derrida, comment vivre ensemble, how to live together after all these war conflicts. And here between Serbia and Croatia really showed that it was really from below the population exchange. So yes, so more or less is this my comments, and thank you to all.
We'll let Catherine Perron and Bazin answer first, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor.
First of all, I think I can speak in the name of Catherine. If we would like to thank you very much for this reading of the book and for those comments, which actually confirms us in saying that we should research further and probably edit a second book, because there are so many things we should we could you know, work and deepen. So thank you, Catherine, for your comments also about our introduction, because at some point we were wondering whether we were too ambitious, actually, in that we are always too ambitious, probably in an introduction. So we try to be clear, but also, first of all, for ourselves, and also there was a way to probably to be as precise as possible with our colleagues, actually, when we asked them to focus on what we wanted to focus. And it's interesting what you said about the chapter about Karelia, because it's probably the chapter that was rewritten the most time. Catherine will probably confirm that. And it was very, no, and then actually we had many opportunities to discuss what we thought and what we wanted and what at stake with the authors. And so we are very glad that the result actually was interesting, at least for you. So, but that's interesting. That was one of the most difficult, I'd say, chapter. Also on which, well, I didn't know anything about, and I'm not sure Catherine knew much more. So we learned also a lot. And actually, I can say that we were starting with the conference, but also with the book. We learned a lot through the project of the book, and really to the very end, and sort of so that for that matter was very interesting. I just answered to two things, and then I give the floor to Catherine. Yeah, well, I agree about, of course, about the Holocaust, about the interpretation about, you know, the comparison with the Holocaust, and I think it is nevertheless, it is really interesting, and actually to go even beyond that, this is a question that I would like to work on, or at least to read interesting things about, is the position and the memory of the Holocaust in memory studies in general, and as a reference for actors as well as actually for academics, and how it has been for a very long time kind of a pivot, and I think, according to what I've been reading, but probably not enough, that it is changing. It has been evolving in the last decade, certainly, and this is something I would very much like to deepen a little more, and to so the place today in memorial debates of this issue, and maybe to react to what Katja said about the naming. Yes, we could probably discuss that, and it's very I think it's very interesting, and also the way the language have evolved also in the time, meaning that, you know, after the event you have some terms that would be used, and then those terms may change and may evolve also in time, which also I think it's another layer of complexity to the issue you're raising, which is very interesting. You mentioned languages, and I would even add also translation, which in another aspect, it's not just languages, it's always how you translate in one in the other language. So I've been working on that more specifically on the Czech-German case, which is quite clear. But if you look also on international documents, legal documents, for instance, how you would translate, well, the expulsion, to put it short. So this is, I think, also very very complex, and much more than just the way a population would address an issue. Just to finish about the what you mentioned about the instrumentalization of the past. Of course, I can only agree with you. There are many examples, but the well, the Czech Germans was another one, actually, for the integration of the adhesion in the European Union. But the question, I think, to go a little beyond that is whether precisely the European space could be the space where those questions can be addressed. So once actually those countries belong to the same area of cooperation, where borders have, let's say, a different meaning that they have in a very realistic approach of international relations. So whether, you know, the way the European Union considers it as really dialogue space or political space, whether that new context could create, let's say, favorable conditions or help, or even a catalyst for that kind of debate about this path to go behind this instrumentalization. Thank you.
I will try to complement. Well, I don't know if there's a lot to say and to complementary. Maybe coming back to what Catherine Gousseff said about the politics of history. Catherine, I think I agree with you. And at we were not sure anymore at the end whether this was the right term. However, what it helped us to do at the beginning of the project was, since most of the expulsions are not so known, one of the things we really had to be very clear about, and which was not always very easy, was to have the authors not make a history lesson about what happened, but really have this reflection about the way in history, during time, let's say, this painful episode was dealt with by historians, but also by the ex-police themselves, by the governments and so on. So I agree with you. Maybe it's more the politics of the past than Geschichtspolitik. That would certainly be right, since we were interested in all kinds of spheres where the past was present and presented. So this is certainly right. Also, one word about this question of Holocaust memory, which is certainly a matrix. I think it's a very important point which would need some more reflections, or would deserve some more reflections. First, there's a debate about the definition of forced migrations and its link to genocides. And most of the authors who have written about forced migrations have this point in their reflections as how to separate both, or is it one same phenomenon pushed to the end, or are they two separate phenomena? And most, I think almost all authors agree that it's not the same phenomenon. This is about the academic debate, and this academic debate you can find, and you can have not a debate, but you can see that all the groups of ex-police use that matrix of the memory of the Shoah to claim rights. And that is very interesting. You see that in Greece, you see that in Germany, you see that I think almost everywhere. That is a lot used. So it's very important to be very clear about that. And it's very clear that this is used to make claims, and especially the claim to be a victim, and the claim that you have to be recognized as a victim. And when you use that claim that you have, and I think in the Greece case, the Pontic genocide has been recognized by the parliament. Well, it's a very important step, let's say, for the victims, and it's really very meaningful. And maybe also very problematic. So this reference to the genocides and Holocaust memory is very important to think of. Maybe another point which Katja raised, which is, and I think Catherine also we discussed about that, is the need to be very clear about defining what these what population transfers are, and whether you can all name them the same. And there are some methodological reflections on that point which are very important, but I think one has also to have always in mind that there are different steps, and in time, if you take for instance the German case, you have very, very different moments, and which are all subsumed under the same Vertreibung, which is not at all the same. If you fled in front of the Red Army in the winter of '44 in Eastern Prussia, or if you were expelled in a very violent way and how do you say, savage, not organized way in '45, or if the transfer took place after the Potsdam agreements under a kind of international agreement. Well, you have these phases which correspond to different types, or if you're, how do you call, Spätaussiedler coming from Russia today, which is also considered as, you will also be considered in Germany as an expellee. And well, the violence is much. So I think also one very important and interesting point to think about is the question of violence, which we have not addressed, but this is another point. Yes, it's very important to be very precise about all that and to think how to subsume it under this term of forced migrations, since also well, it seems that the transfers that take place under international agreements are much less violent than the transfers that take place that do not take place under international agreements, which does not mean that it's better, because there may be, how do you say, more encompassing, but well, that's an important point. And maybe to what you said also, which we didn't mention, but which is in the introduction and which has to be deepened, and what Catherine mentioned in disregard to the Ukraine, which is a reflection about that instrument of forced or population transfer or forced displacement, how to judge it, well, because it's also about judging it today. And it's clear that it's maybe very paradoxical that the moment where it was the most used as an instrument was right after the Second World War, which was also the moment where international human rights were addicted. And so it's very contradictory. The time where the UN Charter on Genocide was proclaimed is exactly the time when the most important population transfers took place. And it was very clearly said that population transfers were no genocide, and so on and so on. And so the position towards international law and how it is seen today in international, this instrument is seen today in international relations, I think is a very interesting thing to think about, because it seems that until today, it's not so easy to have an opinion on that. And well, it's, how to say, since Yugoslavia, it's supposed to be the last thing to do, and the international community will try to do everything possible to get the people to get back. But it also has been shown that the people don't go back. If you don't bring them back very quickly, then it's forever. First point. And second, that you don't have, as Catherine said, so many alternatives to it. What to do else? So as a instrument in international relations, it's not so easy. Well, there is a reflection to be continued on that instrument, and we see it with the Rohingyas today. We see it in many, many places. We see it in Karabakh and so on. And this kind of spirale de la violence, as Anne mentioned in her presentation at the beginning, it's very difficult to say who are the victims and who are the perpetrators, since it's really depends on when you start history. So maybe I'll stop here, because there's a lot to say, but for us it's interesting to hear your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful, wonderful event. I feel I learned a lot. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm definitely, I definitely will. My question is maybe slightly, quite maybe methodological in a way, because I am very impressed by your courage to really enter the endeavor of comparing, which I find very, very tricky generally. So this comparative approach, I can see it as extremely beneficial and fruitful, but also having many dangerous positions. And I think the issue arising from such endeavor is the problem of comparing really pain, comparing suffering of others and misfortune of others, which I would argue inevitably leads to the danger of normativity trap. By that, I mean that consciously or unconsciously, we might have the tendency to not only contextualize and not only compare, but also to evaluate suffering in order to compare it. And I was wondering if that was something you came across, and if yes, how did you go, or how did you went about or across it? Thank you.
So maybe we'll collect a few questions and answer them. So Michal Frankel has a question as well.
So thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. And also, I haven't read the book, but I'm looking forward to doing so. And I was struck by the absence of European memory of population transfers that you've highlighted. And it might, as you mentioned, it might seem surprising now for someone who's located in Prague and remembers all the debates about Czech, German history, the expulsion of Germans and all of that, which also is a transnational discussion. In many ways, on the Czech, German, Polish German, and other levels, this was an entry ticket into the European Union, especially in the 1990s. So trying to understand why we see such a gap or such an absence on the European level, I was wondering if there's something like an imagination about Eastern Europe that is related to population transfers. If this is something that prevents us discussing that as a European topic, Europe-wide, so that things like ethnic cleansing, mass displacement is something that we imagine for the East, as opposed to the topics that we discussed in relationship to the West. So is the memory of population transfer something that actually sharpens this divide, East-West divide in Europe? And is that part of your analysis in any way?
My question is practical, because what is lost for one party becomes a burden or a gain for another. So typically, forced migration equals rupture in the cultural practice on a given territory. But how about any new trends in dealing with this lost heritage and appropriating it by the new owners for their own purposes? So for example, in a disguise of a town twinning exchange, or as adding to the touristic attractivity of any given locality. Are there any examples of bringing back the original culture to its place of origin at the invitation of new hosts on a grassroots or top-down level? So a kind of revival, let's say, rather than examples of placing the memorialization in a new and somehow exotically located spots, like what you have shown, a museum of East Prussia in the West German town of Lüneburg, or a museum of Kresy in the Western Polish town of Gorzów, for example. Thank you.
I'll try to answer, well, to maybe not answer, but to continue on Johana, maybe question about the comparison. As you may have noticed, there is no conclusion in the book. So I think it's part of the answer, probably, in the sense that we wanted to raise the question of whether, I mean, we were convinced that to have a broader approach would be interesting, would be useful, and would help probably to go further and to get deeper into the case studies. But so that's how we really address the issues, and this is what actually we discuss with the participant to the book, but we avoided to conclude on actually what we had, the criteria and the entry for the comparison that we have raised. And to deal with the pain that you mentioned, well, I think that because Catherine and myself, we have been working before actually the book on, especially the expulsion of the Germans. We have had actually a lot of opportunities to think about that and to think about what to do with that. I mean, I remember having interviews with student Germans and the comparisons, and some comparisons were complicated to me at the time. So I think I can speak for Catherine too, because we were actually in Prague in the mid-90s, where really that debate was pretty intense and fascinating, actually. So what I would say that we had kind of the occasion to think of about how to deal, actually, I would say, with that issue. So I'm not saying that we succeeded in avoiding that and what the normativity trap, as you mentioned, but I think that we had the first experience, I would say, on the issue that probably helped a little bit. I hope that well, certainly it helped me. I'm not sure that I went far enough, but certainly it helped. As far as Michèle's question, well, of course, the Czech-German case and the Polish-German case are central, but they are so central that actually this is where we started from, in a way. And there are two things. The first, and actually that's the reason why Eva and Hans Hennings's chapter is the first chapter, and it's really I would say the core chapter also of the book. Not saying that they are defining the pattern for the rest, but certainly because they raise questions also on an issue that have been, working on for decades, actually. So we were pretty much in phase with their approach, for having had many opportunities to work with them. So this is why we started with that. And then we thought, so Germany is the beginning of the book, but it should not be everywhere in the book. So that's the reason why there is not a specific chapter on the Czech-German, for instance, transfer or expulsion. And well, what also we were actually, while reflecting on this, on the question of the laws associated with transfer of population, is what did fascinate us is the fact precisely that even though we had the same a priori that you mentioned, that, oh, well, okay, that's the Yugoslavs, that's, Central Europe, that's a Central European issue. They do that all the time there. And actually, if you look a little more carefully, you realize how it's untrue, and how actually the question of forced migration do concern many European nations. But I remember when I was working in the mid-90s on the Czech-German expulsion in Prague, having discussion with Czech historian, raising comparison. Well, they told me, well, it's a little bit like the Pieds Noirs from France who were expelled from Algeria. So really, also you have, because the references on the comparison pushed by the actors themselves tended to precisely to externalize, I'd say, the issue to the rest of the world. the Palestinian Nakba being one of the main, expulsion being one of the main, certainly issue that has been referred to in addition to the to World War II, after World War II. So that's the reason why we moved a little further Central Europe. Not that because we are not interested, on the contrary, because this is where we started from. And as far as Lydia's question is, I entirely agree, and I think that there is a fascinating, I would love to read a book about that. So I think there is a fascinating, this is definitely a fascinating issue, and that would be in a way very complementary to the research, to the topic we try to address in this one, but probably even more complicated. But yes, we should move forward. Thank you.
Maybe one interesting thing, which might be a reason also why we published this book, and we shouldn't have published it in English, but it's always a very difficult question, is which language you publish what. Is that in France, you have some reflections about forced migrations. Catherine Gousseff is the best example of it, but not so many, and certainly not general ones. And so maybe, I don't know if you can say it's a Western German imaginary about Eastern German, but it's very clearly a topic that the Germans are thinking together with their Eastern neighbors. And there have been a lot of discussions between Western Germans, or Germans in general, and their Eastern neighbors. And the French have not been so present on that issue. And I think it was very important. And for instance, Anne's PhD about Czech-German relation was very important because it was written by a French. And it was like kind of opening this face-to-face, which is not to say that the French didn't have, like, for instance, I learned that the French were among the first to practice expulsions from the Alsace. They expelled Germans after the defeat 1980. So you see, it's not absent from our own history. But it's not very present, and so I think it's not exactly a question, but I think to us it was the more important to tackle these issues as French, or to say, well, it's important also that French get involved in that kind of discussions. And if you look at who wrote what about expulsions, like the general books have been written by Austrians, Philipp Theer, by Germans, Michael Schwarz, by I guess Jewish American, who were the first ones who were interested in that topic in a way, and you see how own historical background certainly plays. And so it was, maybe it was, and here to come back to CEFRES, it was maybe one of the very good things that CEFRES allowed French researchers that, well, through their presence there, came to see that subject and to be interested in some issues which you wouldn't normally in France grasp. So that might be, well, one point which I would add to your comment. And to Lydia, well, that's very fascinating. And as Anne said, it could be the topic for book 2. We have done some things on that, like with Katja in Koper. This was a kind of a point we had, and with Michèle, it's a kind of reflection we had also in our seminar at the EHESS. Well, what are the people that remain do with the heritage they find, and when do they get interested in, and how do they try to get rooted, like the next generation that arrived somewhere tries to get rooted somewhere and thinks, well, argues all the history of the place is ours, and start to get interested and to unveil that history that, for instance, the communist regimes have tried to erase. The Poles have done that, the young Poles, and I think there are many young Czechs doing that today also, like to try to make contacts with the Germans who went and to have them come back in a way or another. So this is certainly a very interesting point to study, which needs to be completed. But I think some people here are doing this precisely.
So you've mentioned actually the case of the Rohingyas or Hrobat as like first migrations as an ongoing history. And I was wondering, so as much as the memory of forced migration is very like fragmented along national or local lines, it is a shared or common feature in European societies, but at the same time, those forced migrations are not uniquely European. So I was wondering, to what extent is this memory, as fragmented as it is, distinctively European? Michèle has a question.
No, it's not a question, but it was also to stress this issue of comparison. I think that definitively the issue or the question is not to compare experiences and history and what happens in history. So, of course, there is no comparison between what happened in Algeria, for example, and in the Czech Republic. But maybe we can compare how this, the effect and the uses in the present of these histories, and how it still matters for people and countries. And so maybe there is a comparison to do between these uses and effects, and how also they circulate between countries, between people, between specific circles of people. So I think it's important, because if we don't do that, we can't understand, for example, why the concept of Nakba or Holocaust is also reappropriated by different groups in different countries, different spaces, in order to describe their own experience of displacement, loss, or these kind of things. So I think this comparison could be done in the present, but not in order to reconstitute what happens in history and to compare different histories, spaces, and this kind of thing. That's it.
I'm not sure I have the answer, but I totally agree with what Michèle just said about the fact that it's what's interesting is the way the memory or of the forced migrations is reappropriate in other contexts, actually. And for that matter, there is something we did not underline, but which I think was important for the actually the exchanges we had in the group for the book, was the fact that with a multidisciplinary approach of the topic, with anthropologists, sociologists, historians, of course, political scientists, and so on. And I think that helps probably to open precisely the discussion to that kind of question, and to also probably exit the to European approach.
I think, well, it's important to see that it's not a European phenomenon, and I think the historians were very interested in seeing, or one question the historians are asking themselves, which is not what we are doing, since we're not working on that as historians, but was to find whether, well, one of the most important population transfer was in India, between India and Pakistan in 1949. And I think the question of the role of the colonial powers and the pattern of population, the use of this kind of pattern in international relations is certainly questioned and has to be questioned, as well as during the Palestinian Nakba, as during the Indian-Pakistanis exchange of population. So maybe this is a way to show that this is certainly not a European, well, something specific, that there might be something linked to European powers. And since one of the very big first ones, the Greek-Turkish, was done under the, how do you say, sous l'égide of the French and of the British, who were very much in favor of this, as far as I know, as a non-historian and not specialist of this. So maybe this is something that could be, that might be addressed, but it's not our topic. It's more the topic of historians. And as Anne and Michèle underlined, what is interesting for us is the kind of to look at if we find the same or similar kind of patterns of use of this past in the present, in different contexts today. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any more like raised hand or questions, and I think we are reaching the end of today's discussion. So once again, I would like to thank our speakers, Anne Bazin, Catherine Perron, Catherine Gousseff, Katja Hrobat, for remotely joining us today, and also all of you who joined us and asked very stimulating questions.
Thank you very much. Bye.
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 Bye.